I like that you use the term cult.
Hmm.
I think it's good because, to me, branding and popularity kind of go hand in hand. Um, and, to me, flavors or those that are able to define flavors, are basically it kind of falls into the same game.
Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 3 of a 5-part series where we are talking about tasting coffee, but we're not talking about the kind of thing that we're not talking key lime pie, we're not talking about passion fruit, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the kind of more nuanced philosophical, economic associations with tasting coffee. In this episode, Kosta, we're going to talk about assigning financial values to the subjectivity of flavor and what ramifications that has. So what ramifications does it have?
Yeah, like what I ended up talking about beforehand, in the previous episode is this idea that, like, if taste isn't objective, if we can go ahead and use just that framework for now,
Mm-hmm.
um, and if we're essentially trying to describe volatile compounds, but these volatile compounds you can express themselves as different flavors. So, I used the example of almond and cherry, and we could taste the same coffee and we would both be right. But, like, what we end up doing, is basically assigning one, I would say symbolic value.
Mm-hmm.
This coffee, tastes like cherry, and because we have this presupposition that fruitier coffees are just better, more
Mm-hmm.
inherent, pure of flavor, then we assign it a higher cup score. And if we assign it a higher cup score, then we assign it with higher financial value.
Mm.
Versus something like almond. An almond tends to not be valued nowhere near as close as it is, by buyers across the board. And so to me, like, this isn't a search for objectivity in coffee. Um, this is, in my opinion, an attempt at practicing consensus making.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're attempting to manage basically the subjective experience of humans around taste,
Mm-hmm.
and we make this very uncomfortable, in my opinion, uncomfortable. um what's the word I'm looking for? It's just slipping my mind. Compromise.
Mm-hmm.
um that if we're going to, that we should assign, like, flavors certain financial values,
Mm-hmm.
but, like, those financial values are based off of, like, subjective experiences and not objective experiences whatsoever. And what tends to happen is, those that have more symbolic and financial capital end up basically creating the game. Like, it's their flavors that they like that end up being rewarded with higher symbolic value and as well as, like, financial value.
That's
um
Go on.
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I was going to say really quickly, anthropologist Ted Fisher, he describes third wave coffee with COE as, like, this winner take all economic scheme. It's this idea that you bring a whole bunch of coffees together and the highest coffee ends up, winning at the end of the day. But the ones who end up defining on who wins, he takes this twist on Marx. He's not a Marxist, but he takes this twist on Marx that it's not about owning the means of production, i.e., it's not about owning the farm, it's not about owning the coffee or the workers. It's about, for him, owning the symbolic means of production, the assigning meaning to the coffee itself. What flavors are there in the coffee and what it's worth? It's the same way, for example, he uses the example of Apple and Apple's IP and branding as owning the symbolic means of production. They don't own mining companies in China, for example. They end up purchasing it, on pennies for the dollar, but it's really their branding, i.e., their symbolic capital, that ends up determining the financial value of that coffee. And within specialty coffee, it's typically those that have both symbolic capital as well as financial capital that end up basically determining what's objective or not.
And I guess that we need to look at the nuance in that of different industries. And what I mean by that is the commercial coffee industry and the specialty coffee industry, because branding is playing a role in all of these. And my question to you would be, what role do markets play in this?
Oh gosh. Oh,
Because at the end
could
of
you
the
continue,
day,
please?
a buyer can go vote on a COE coffee or bid on a COE coffee, win that lot, and if they don't move that coffee, it means fucking nothing. Like at the end of the day, that coffee has nowhere near the value that was associated with it, and the person who purchased the coffee is left holding that with no economic out for that, like no economic gain, unless they have a brand that's well known and they can trick their consumers if they've built up enough of a cult to convince them that they should buy this coffee. Now, taste has nothing to do with it. Now, we have convinced people by writing stuff on a bag that, you know, it tastes like diamonds and rainbows and fucking cherries and whatever it is. Now we're using that as a way to push an economic agenda that has nothing to do with the objectivity or the subjectivity of flavor. Now it becomes a game.
Yeah. Yeah. And go ahead, please.
What role do you think that market dynamic has to do with this?
Yeah. You know, it's I don't know. I mean, I think my current opinion at the moment, you know, is it's basically, you know, those that have.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's first on-demand workshop, How to Become a Coffee Consultant, available now online for you to learn at your own pace with a certificate available upon completion. Click the link in the show notes to access today for just €50.
You know, I like that you use the term cult. I think it's good because, you know, to me, branding and popularity kind of go hand in hand. And, you know, to me, flavors, or those that are able to define flavors, you know, are basically, it kind of falls into the same game, you know, like if like, you know, a brand that's considered a marketing darling describes the coffee as XYZ, you know, at that point, like they end up winning. And Ted Fisher ends up kind of building, you know, he ends up building like this example of within COE, you know, those that are COE winners tend to get
Cup of excellence. For anybody who doesn't know what we mean by COE, cup of excellence. Go ahead.
Yeah. So cup of excellence, you know, let's say top 20 winners get anywhere between 4 to, you know, 100 times worth the value of that coffee. And what he ended up doing in his paper, I think it's Quality versus Inequality, is he looked at a geographic region within Guatemala, and identified where a few Cup of Excellence winners were, and then the farms that were neighboring it. Basically collected all those samples. Let's say 4 producers were Cup of Excellence winner. There's 50 producers in the area. Collects all of them, ends up going to Cupping Lab and Anna Cafe, cups the coffees. They all score similar. What's the difference at the end of the day? You know, those that essentially were able to afford to like enter into this competition in the first place, and those that were able to go ahead and assign it, you know, like a cup score, and the fact that it had the Cup of Excellence label on it. Like that's the only difference.
It's the brand
at the end of the day. It's the brand.
Help people who don't understand the role of cupping. Help people understand at origin versus the roastery what the difference between those two cupping objectives is.
Ooh, okay. So I'm gonna give it a shot and let me know if I'm on the right track. Okay.
Yeah, you're a green coffee buyer.
yeah. I mean, it's
and a trader, right? Like this is your wheelhouse. So go ahead. I'm not going to correct you on this.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I mean, like if I put myself in the shoes of like a green coffee trader or a buyer, you know, for the most part, if I'm just looking at sensory analysis, what I'm looking for are flavors that resonate with me. And I'm also looking for consistency, and I have to stick within a budget.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're scoring that coffee based on the green, the quality of the green. You're scoring it on based on its processing method, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Coffee roasters hold on. One other thing, you're scoring that cup for defects as well.
Yeah,
what
like
you're
paying
tasting, right?
intimate details to it. Yeah.
Based on the green.
Mhm.
You're ignoring the roast
Yeah, as much as possible.
as much as possible, right?
Yes. Yeah.
A roaster that's cupping his coffee or her coffee or their coffee, they are heavily focusing on any potential roasting defects, as well as trying to pick up the green coffee or what they can taste in the green coffee. And so, the reason I mention this is so for those who are trying to understand why we're talking about cupping at origin, it's a very different objective when we're cup of excellence cupping versus, and what we're tasting there, what we're looking to taste when we're tasting coffee at origin and cupping at origin is very different based on what's happening on the consuming end when we're cupping coffees in the roastery. That itself is another layer to the complexity of what we're talking about when we are assigning economics to taste. Why people are making buying decisions at origin versus the consumer making buying decisions based on a cup score or the flavors that we're assigning. The roast itself is going to impact the way that coffee is expressed. You may roast the cherry out of the coffee if you don't know what you're doing. Or you may intentionally roast the cherry out of the coffee if you do know what you're doing, which is a completely different assignment of what's happening when people are cupping it at origin. And the thing that blows my fucking mind about this industry is that we don't do enough to help people understand that. This is such a complex agricultural product with such a complicated supply and value chain. And we have the lowest barrier to fucking entry of pretty much any industry. Why? And we talk about these things as though they're actual fact. Like, taste is fact. And it's just not. And we don't give people nearly enough room to have opinions and nearly enough of a comfort zone to be able to express what they're experiencing in that coffee without being hounded about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's almost like those two different processes kind of come with two different attitudes as well. You know, when you're sampling coffees, you know, green coffee in particular, and you're having a sample roast, you're typically treating it with like a deep level of suspicion. You know, and I mean, even the cupping form itself, before there was a 100-point cupping form, there was a 50-point cupping form. And the SCA cupping form was developed. What it ended up doing, the biggest difference that it ended up doing was institutionalizing defects. There wasn't a space for defects before the SCA cupping form. And the reason that the space was made for the cupping form, or for defects on the cupping form, was inherently to punish coffees. And so that is the attitude in which you end up going into like cupping green coffee, you know. And if I put myself in the shoes of a roaster, you know, who ends up purchasing the coffee, I'm no longer looking to go ahead and punish a coffee. I'm trying to maximize certain characteristics of that coffee. It's almost like a complete mind switch.
Well, and the nuance of that is that, like, who are you buying coffee for? Like, what's the purpose of that coffee? What are you going to be using that coffee for? If it is going to be something that is going to end up in a blender, and like you're going to blend that coffee, and the purpose of that coffee is to be a blender coffee, you have a whole different frame of decision making, thought processes that go into purchasing that coffee versus purchasing into the single origins that you're buying. And are you buying for third wave shops? Are you buying for, you know, 7-Eleven?
Yeah.
So perhaps the frame of reference, and look, folks, if you're listening to this and you're like, I'm so confused now, like, how am I supposed to rate if a coffee tastes good in inverted commas? Because that's what people assign a financial value to, right? Does this coffee give me the hug that I'm looking for? If it does, it's worth the money that I'm going to spend on it. If it doesn't, it's not worth the money that I'm going to spend on it. And that aligns across the entire supply chain. The complexity of what good means and the complexity of what you're looking for is so nuanced that deciding if a coffee is worth it requires its own thesis. And that's the nuance that our industry operates at. So in the next episode, that's where we're going to answer that question. Does the role that taste plays in our industry create a power dynamic? Because the money is where the power starts to come in. The decisions that lead to the money conversation is where the power dynamic happens. And so we're going to explore that in the next episode. Please join us. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.